America's great ally in the Middle East, a democracy led by this passionate leader, leading a country, once again, that is literally surrounded by its enemies. Now listen to this incredible story of strength, perseverance, how Bibi became Israel's longest-serving prime minister.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, thank you so much for your time. I've been speed reading through your book. It is a remarkable life story, and it could only have been told because of the fact that you were voted out of office. Now you're back in office, back in the fire.
Yeah, well, indeed. But I'm grateful to the previous government for having given me a year to write this book, which I wrote in longhand. And there's no way, Doug, that I could have written it while in office. So that's done. And now I'm going back into the messy bog of politics, refreshed and with another book behind me. An important book for me, at least, and I hope for the readers as well.
Well, it's an important book, indeed, and one of the reasons that it's important, at least from my perspective, is that I learned so much more about your young life, your early life, that I did not know before and that readers will find out about, and it's fascinating, truly fascinating. You are, in effect, a part-time American as well. Your father brought you to the United States on two separate occasions, one as a little boy, you and your two brothers, and your older brother, Yoni, who is a national hero in Israel, should be a national hero, an international hero, I guess he is, was once quizzed by a teacher as a young boy in school because he was a remarkable student. Everybody recognized this. People were drawn to your brother because of his quiet strength, his leadership, his courage, his fortitude. And your brother didn't pay a lot of attention to that because he longed for going back home to Israel. And he said this, it's a very telling comment, quote, "Here in America, my classmates don't know what they're living for, but in Israel, we know."
Well, we certainly do, and I think many Americans know that too, because our time in America afforded Yoni and me and my younger brother Ido the opportunity to appreciate and admire America as ultimately as the guarantor of liberty in human civilization. Because if it weren't for America, we'd all be living under the boot of totalitarian regimes. The pictures you see there that I see on the screen are of me, because having studied high school in America, I followed Yoni going back to Israel. We both served in the same elite forces, special forces of the Israeli army. And my younger brother actually joined us. So we were three brothers in a tiny unit. It doesn't include more than 100 fighters. And I became an officer. You see me there. Believe it or not, that was me once. We took part in many clandestine operations behind enemy lines. I described that my years as a soldier and an officer in a special unit. But things came to a head when they had to separate us because we couldn't be on the same missions, especially storming a hijacked aircraft in which I was wounded. You see me there in a sling. But we did that. Yoni was very anxious to join me in that rescue. And I said, "You can't go in there. There are only 16 soldiers and I'm there with my soldiers. You can't come in there." And he said, "Well, I'm the most experienced combat soldier and officer in the unit." I said, "That's true, but you're my brother and you're not going in." And he said, "Well, I'll replace you." I said, "You can't. These are my soldiers." He said, "So we'll both go in." And I said, think of father and mother. Think of what would happen if one of us or both of us got killed. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Bibi, my life is my own and my death is my own." And I couldn't accept that, of course. We went in sharp disagreement to the unit commander. He decided in my favor. Yoni was left behind with Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, and Shimon Peres, who was the transportation minister at the time, waiting to see how we would liberate this aircraft, the first time anybody tried it in history. Well, we succeeded, but I got wounded by friendly fire in the course of the liberating the hostages. And I was taken off the plane. I was given morphine on the tarmac to ease the pain. And I saw Yoni running from a distance to me, running, this terrible look of distress on his face. And as he got closer and closer, he sort of hovered above me. He saw the white splatter of blood on my sleeve, And he said to me, and this big grin spread on his face, and he said, "See, Bibi, I told you not to go." So he was very happy that I didn't die. And I left
Well,
the unit and went to study in the United States. He stayed and became the commander of this special unit. And 4 years later, liberated another hijacked plane that was taken to the heart of Africa in the most spectacular rescue mission of modern times. They liberated all the hostages, but there was one military casualty, and it was him, the commander, who fell while leading his men first.
right. Your older brother Yoni, again, a national hero in Israel, a hero whose death is honored every year in your home country. And you describe in the book the utter, total devastation upon learning of his death, because he was truly an innate leader. He had these qualities that very, very few people have. And you looked up to him like few younger brothers look up to their older brothers that I've ever seen. Describe for us the moment you learned that he had been killed in the Entebbe raid. Again, a raid which goes down in human history as perhaps the most effective anti-terrorism operation in history.
Well, it occurred on the 4th of July, 1976, the bicentennial of the United States, which was a great celebration of liberty. And I was with other Israeli students at MIT at the time, and I was taking in the sights, the tall ships in the Boston Harbor, and everybody was on a picnic, and everybody was celebrating. And all of a sudden, we heard the news break out in the radio that an Israeli commando force had liberated these hostages who had been held in Entebbe, Uganda, and they were making their way back to Israel. And I was very happy. I was overjoyed. And then I heard something on the radio that disturbed me, because they said one officer was killed. And I asked, why did they say officer? Normally they'd say one soldier was killed. Why did they say officer? So I went to the bookshelf, took out a world atlas, computed the distance from Israel to Entebbe, several thousand miles. I figured that would take 3 to 4 Hercules transport planes. That means 150 to 200 soldiers. A quarter of them at least would be officers, because they'd fight to get into such a mission. So what were the odds? 1 to 50. We've been through worse odds before in the unit, and we came out alive. And yet I couldn't rest. I called my younger brother, Ido, in Israel, and I asked, is Yoni back? I didn't ask, was Yoni leading it? There was no question that our unit would lead such a mission. And he said, no, he hasn't come back. And then I called back a few hours later, and he said, has he come back? And he said, no, but I sense something is not right. And then a few hours later, the phone rang, and it was Ido, my brother, on the other side. And before I picked up the phone, I said to my wife, it's Ido calling to tell me that Yoni has been killed. And Ido said to me that Yoni had been killed. And there was this indescribable silence of agony on both sides of the line. And I said the only thing I could think of at that point were my parents. My father was teaching, he's a historian, and he was teaching at the time at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. So I drove for 7 hours from Boston to Ithaca, because I didn't want them to hear the news through the media. And I walked up on the path leading to my father's home, and I saw him through the window, because it was a big glass window at the front of his house, and he was walking back and forth, sort of in deep thought, his hands clasped behind his back. That was his habit. And all of a sudden he turned around and he looked, and he saw me, and he said, Bibi, what are you doing here? And then he saw my face, and he immediately understood. And he let out a terrible cry, like a wounded animal. And then I heard my mother scream. I could say that was actually worse. Telling my parents about Yoni's death was actually worse than hearing about it from my brother. But these are two moments of sheer agony that I thought I would never live through. I didn't think that I would continue to live. I didn't know how I would live. But through inconsolable grief, I found a way to be inspired by Yoni's sacrifice, his courage, his heroism, and the fact that he died fighting terrorism. I devoted a good chunk of my life after that to mobilizing the free world to not only a military fight, but a military and political fight against international terrorism. And from there, I was swept into politics and to the messy bog of politics, as I call it today.
Mm-hmm. You had a premonition that your brother was going to die, it sounds like to me. And the interesting thing to me is that he also had a premonition about your future. You didn't learn this until later in life, but one of his, I believe it was either high school or college roommates, later confided in you. He said, watch Bibi. He's going to become prime minister one day.
Yeah, I absolutely shocked me when I learned about this 50 years later in the annual memorial to Yoni at his graveside. And one of his university friends came to me and said that he had told him that when I was 19 years old, he said, watch my brother, he's going to be prime minister one day. So I have the faintest idea where he took that. I had very strong opinions, too strong, untempered by experience, just the certitude of youth. And I was absolutely stupefied when I learned that 50 years later, at that time, he was convinced that I would one day lead the state of Israel. And I have no idea, and I tell you this honestly, how he could have such a premonition, because I certainly didn't have it.
Well, the habits learned early in life oftentimes lead to great things. And one example of that, and this is my last time I'll harp on your military service because I want to move on to that, but you write briefly about your second day in this elite unit, the unit as it was informally called, and you had to take a hike up the coast of Israel, and it turned out to be just absolutely horrid weather, the worst storm in decades, and there was no paved roads on the coastal route of Israel at that time. You write, quote, the next day, muscles sore but invigorated, we were asked to come to a big hangar. We assumed we would be issued our personal weapons, but no weapons were to be seen. Instead, we were given a pocket-sized notepad and a pen with a string attached to our shirt pocket. This, the commander said, is one of your most important weapons. Write down every task you are assigned to do and don't tear off the page until every task is accomplished. Half a century later, I haven't shaken that habit. What a great lesson for anybody striving for great things.
It's true, because I've met people who've achieved great things in life, business leaders, political leaders, and so on. But I haven't met anyone who's achieved great things without following through on the little things as well. You have to have the big picture, but you also have to have, you have to work on the small things as well. The details count, no question about that. So I still do that. By the way, I write down everything. I don't have a notepad like that. I just have a piece of paper. Every day, it's an unshakable habit. I don't intend to shake it.
Well, good for you. I wish I'd adopted that pattern long ago, but I'm a confused individual. The other really monumental person in your life, well, both of your parents were monumental, but your father especially, who was an intellectual giant. He was the editor for the Hebrew Encyclopedia, the Hebrew version, I guess, of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And so he had a tremendous command of facts. He edited those facts down. But it was not until later in life that you learned about his involvement in Zionism. And in fact, in many respects, he predicted the Holocaust in the 1930s. You wrote, even as a 23-year-old in 1933, my father was one of those who was remarkably perceptive, who sensed what was coming. That year, he wrote what appears to be, in hindsight, an astonishing prophecy. Quote from your father, racial anti-Semitism is inciting a global war against the existence of the Jews as a race that poisons human society. If racial anti-Semitism spreads, it will not only endanger Jewish rights, but the existence of Jewish people everywhere. Written in 1933 by your father.
By a 23-year-old young man. Now, he was, in many ways, my mother used to say, I married a genius, but even a genius has to have his socks darned. So she took care of his socks. My father would wear. He was like a genius, absent-minded professor with an intellect so sharp that I've seldom encountered in life some people with that perception. He had the ability to see how events would lead and what needed to be done to either forestall them or advance them. And he argued in the 1930s that he came to America actually on the eve of World War II, and he wanted to persuade the United States to press Britain to enable the creation of the Jewish state, first to give the millions of Jews who were trapped in Europe by Nazism a haven, a safe haven. And he argued that this was important not only for the Jewish people, but he argued that the creation of a Jewish state would serve the interest of America because it would create the strong bastion of Western values in the heart of the Middle East, and as he predicted, also the barricade against Soviet aggression. Well, people didn't take him seriously initially, but and Roosevelt was absolutely, President Roosevelt, who was a great war leader, was adamantly opposed to Zionism because the British at the time were opposed to it, and they thought it would offend their Arab subjects of the British Empire. So my father decided to do something in the wake of Roosevelt's opposition that no one had done before. He went to the Republicans and he met with Senator Taft, a legendary figure in his own right, and persuaded him to adopt in the Republican national platform, in the Republican National Convention in 1944, a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state. This is in the middle of the Holocaust. And sure enough, as my father predicted, a few months later, the Democratic National Convention adopted a similar platform. So in many ways, my father was in his early 30s, was the progenitor of the bipartisan American support for the state of Israel. And he had many meetings, but one more particularly incisive meeting. And that was right after the war. I think 2 years after the war, he met with General Eisenhower. General Eisenhower was the commander of the army, just led a victorious America in World War II. And my father got to see him. And he said to him, "You should support the creation of a Jewish state." And Eisenhower said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, it's going to be the greatest force in the Middle East," and so on. He said, how could that be? You're only 600,000 people. That's our number at the time. It has grown more than tenfold since then. And my father said, "General, you've just seen in 2 world wars how we Jews fight for others. Can you imagine how powerful we'll be when we fight for ourselves?" And Eisenhower was sufficiently impressed that he got the whole general staff of the United States to meet with this young man, because my father spoke not only of justice, of morality, but he spoke also of national interest. He said that it's the national interest of the United States to have a strong Israel, and time has proven him so right.
It seems that the tests that Israel faces never end. You've got a bit of a test with our present president of the United States. Well, he did with the previous one. President Trump was not always in favor of the Abraham Accords. Maybe he was, but he said that you specifically were not in favor of peace. That later changed when you confronted him with some evidence. But fast forward to President Biden. You describe in a phone call that you had with President Biden. Now, in our phone call, President Biden said that America stood by Israel's right to defend itself. But in the coming days, as the fighting escalated and the press reported on mounting Palestinian casualties, he began to push for a ceasefire. Quote, "Bibi, I got to tell you, I'm coming under a lot of pressure back here," he said. "This is not Scoop Jackson's Democratic Party," referring to the strikingly pro-Israel senator whose long tenure ended in the 1980s. Indeed, it's a new Democratic Party in the United States, and anti-Semitism is on the rise in this country as well, especially on college campuses.
Well, first of all, let me say that Joe Biden has been a personal friend for 40 years, ever since I came to Washington as a young diplomat, and he came as a young senator from Delaware. So we've had a close friendship for all those decades, and we've also had our disagreements. But it's disagreements, as with all American presidents, it's disagreement, as we say, in the family, because Israel and the United States are like family, and you have arguments in your family, and we have arguments in this family as well. But the bond is strong and unshakable. I can tell you that people don't know this, but sometimes you're overtaken by the chattering classes. But if you look at the tracking poll of the American public as a whole, the support for Israel has grown remarkably. It's grown very strongly among Republicans, but it stayed very strong among Democrats as well. it's the political class and a particular radical fringe of it that obviously adopts anti-Israeli policies. But the overwhelming majority of Americans, Democrats, independents, Republicans alike, support Israel because they understand that we are the bulwark of America in the heart of the Middle East against the radical Islamists who chant. What do they chant? They chant death to Israel, death to America. Israel is the small Satan, you're the big Satan. And they're led by Iran, that wants to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads to threaten not only us, but to threaten you. And so what is keeping them at bay and what is preventing the Middle East from falling into the hands of the radical Islamists is Israel, frankly. Israel, more than any other force in the region, democratic, advanced, innovative Israel that is willing to fight for our defense, but in so doing, we also fight for our common defense. And we're very grateful for any assistance that is being offered by successive American administrations to that for that goal, Democrats and Republicans alike.
And lastly, Prime Minister, your country in that region of the Middle East is a tiny little speck in a sea of totalitarian countries. It has been fought over for centuries, and that fight continues. What is the future of Israel?
Well, we've defied the laws of history. The Jewish people have been around for 3,500 years, for the first 2,000 years, including the period described in the Bible. We lived on our land. We had to fight for our freedom, often losing, but never giving up. And finally, we lost our land and were scattered to the far corners of the earth and came back against all odds 150 years ago, even though there was always a Jewish presence in the Holy Land, rebuilt our state in our ancestral homeland, reunited our capital, Jerusalem. It's been our capital for 3,000 years since King David decided to declare it as such. And it's been a wonder. And, you know, I think the reason we've been able to do that is a combination of faith and guts and resolution. And if there's one thing that is infused in the book that I write, it's the mission that I received from my grandfather, my father, my fallen brother, and so many millions around the world. It's a life of purpose, and my purpose has been to assure the prosperity, security, and permanence of the Jewish state. You know, I don't know how many miracles God apportions to a people, but we've had a pretty big share of ours. But read the book. I think if you're interested in a life of purpose, if you're interested in a life of purpose, and you should be because it makes life worthwhile, you might glean some interesting insights from reading my experience in this. And I'd love to hear your comments.
The book is Bibi, My Story. Prime Minister, thank you so much for your time. You have been a monumental force, your family has been a monumental force in the history of Israel, the survival of Israel, and in the cause of world peace. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it.